Rain is indeed a delightfully relaxing affair when you are safely ensconced beneath a sturdy modern roof, surrounded by comforting central heating, and clutching a smartphone packed full of shows you will only pretend to watch while mindlessly scrolling through something else entirely on a second screen. But for our desperately struggling ancient ancestors, a relentless week of non-stop, heavy rain was far less cozy weather, and much more the entire, fragile survival system has catastrophically ground to a halt. The precious firewood became thoroughly soaked. Fresh animal tracks vanished instantly, local rivers swelled menacingly, leaky caves dripped continuously, and heavy clothing fashioned from animal hides became progressively soggier, icily colder, and increasingly, fiercely committed to smelling absolutely terrible. And yet, against all odds, those resilient people survived. So, what on earth did a prehistoric family actually do when the relentless rain simply refused to stop? Did they sit in awkward, brooding silence, meticulously repair their stone tools, spin dramatic stories, bicker endlessly over prime sleeping spots, or perhaps invent the world's very first indoor hobby because some overly anxious hunter had already eagerly sharpened every single wooden spear twice? The actual answer is far more deliciously complicated than merely hiding under a convenient rock and waiting for the skies to clear. These agonizingly long storms forced early humans to actively manage fire, food, crushing boredom, petty interpersonal conflicts, hyperactive children, and existential fear, all while packed tightly inside incredibly cramped shelters. In other words, those miserably rainy weeks may have quietly helped construct some of the most deeply human characteristics we possess today. Of course, before a rainy week could escalate into a genuine, full-blown human crisis, our clever ancestors first had to painstakingly build a lifestyle that was actually complicated enough for rain to ruin in the first place. That might sound slightly backward, but consider the wonderfully simple design of an ordinary ape. Most sensible primates do not bother to maintain a permanent camp, store dry piles of firewood, or meticulously schedule tomorrow's big hunt around a carefully prepared set of sharp, stone-tipped spears. When the rain inevitably arrives, they simply get wet, look visibly offended by the very sky itself, and casually saunter beneath whatever leafy branches happen to be nearby. Early humans, however, eventually became far more overly ambitious. They began dragging food back to designated, shared base camps, laboriously manufacturing complex tools that took agonizing hours to produce, carefully coordinating dangerous hunts across massive territories, and heavily relying on fire for warmth, culinary endeavors, illumination, and vital protection against predators. Naturally, each brilliant advance made prehistoric life vastly more productive. But quite comically, it also introduced brilliant new ways for the unpredictable weather to utterly wreck everything. Fire, of course, was their absolute biggest, most nerve-wracking dependency. Fascinating evidence from archaeological sites, such as the famous Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, strongly suggests that early hominins were boldly using fire deep inside cavernous depths around 1 million years ago, though modern archaeologists still passionately debate just how regularly those ancient blazes were actually controlled. By hundreds of thousands of years ago, cozy hearths had become significantly more common at several ancient sites. Fire was no longer merely a lucky, chaotic encounter with a lightning-struck burning tree. It had officially become essential infrastructure. And as we all know, infrastructure absolutely hates water. A protracted storm could effortlessly soak exposed fuel piles, swiftly smother weak, struggling embers, and aggressively fill a tight shelter with blinding, choking smoke if damp would burn miserably. Losing that precious fire did not merely mean begrudgingly eating a cold dinner. It tragically meant losing their only reliable heat source at the exact moment when dripping wet skin and chilly air were already aggressively pulling vital warmth from their shivering bodies. It meant significantly less protection from hungry predators. Quite literally, it meant a terrifying darkness arriving with very sharp teeth. Then, there was the stressful matter of basic mobility. Nomadic hunter-gatherers heavily depended on their incredibly detailed knowledge of winding trails, clean water sources, seasonal edible plants, predictable animal movements, and safe river crossings. A sudden, heavy downpour could completely erase vital animal tracks within a few short hours, rapidly turn highly familiar paths into rushing streams, and transform once shallow rivers into impassable, raging barriers. The physical landscape had not technically moved an inch, but functionally, the mischievous climate had completely rearranged the outdoor furniture while everyone was fast asleep. Finding proper shelter also required some serious strategic planning. A cave might stay reasonably dry near its breezy entrance, but suddenly flood catastrophically deeper inside its dark chambers. A massive rock overhang could easily block perfectly vertical rain while doing absolutely nothing to stop the freezing, sideways blowing wind. A clever hide tent could effectively shed water when properly stretched and meticulously maintained, but would quickly sag, leak miserably, or outright collapse once thoroughly soaked. So, the fundamental prerequisite for successfully surviving a miserable week of nonstop rain was not simply raw intelligence. It was an entire package deal. Controlled fire, cooperative group labor, durable stone tools, shared warm shelters, stored generational knowledge, and just enough saintly social tolerance to remain tightly packed together while everyone smelled overwhelmingly like rotting wet leather. Humans had proudly built a complex societal system, and now the dramatic clouds could gleefully attack it. The immediate first response to such relentless, depressing rain was probably not brilliant innovation. It was, of course, sheer irritation. A hopeful hunting party could eagerly leave camp, enthusiastically following hoof prints, freshly broken branches, warm dung, and all those other useful prehistoric notifications announcing that a delicious dinner had recently passed nearby. Then, the rude rains suddenly arrived and thoroughly deleted their entire message history. Tracks softened into muddy puddles, tantalizing scents weakened to a mere whisper, and once polite small streams suddenly became raging torrents, while steep slopes enthusiastically turned into treacherous mudslides designed by nature's absolute least responsible civil engineer. Even the highly successful hunters faced another mildly depressing problem. Bringing their hard-won meat back home before damp conditions, opportunistic insects, and microscopic microbes began turning it into something possessing its own active political agenda. Rain could also unpredictably scatter wild animals into unfamiliar areas or frantically push them toward much higher ground, forcing damp, miserable hunters to choose between taking far greater physical risks and returning entirely empty-handed to a very disappointed family. Gathering, of course, was not automatically any easier. Some edible plants conveniently remained available, especially stubborn roots, dirty tubers, crunchy nuts, shellfish, and various foods collected quite near the dry camp. But actually identifying these plants through heavy, vertical sheets of torrential rain, digging deeply into incredibly saturated soil, or crossing suddenly flooded ground consumed precious energy while drastically increasing the unfortunate chance of injury. A painfully twisted ankle was not merely inconvenient. In those brutal prehistoric days, there were no handy crutches, no nearby urgent care clinics, and absolutely no sympathetic, passive-aggressive emails from human resources. There was only the broken ankle and a lot of quiet regret. So, people naturally retreated, whenever humanly possible, to dark caves, dry rock overhangs, saggy hide-covered structures, or makeshift shelters cobbled together from wet branches and soggy vegetation. But indoors was a rather generous, highly optimistic description. Rain habitually blew sideways, cold water ran directly beneath bedding, heavy roofs sagged under the weight of the deluge, and thick smoke collected under low coverings because the very same barrier keeping the rain out also efficiently kept every single lungful of terrible ventilation inside. This damp purgatory is where necessity began teaching its hardest lessons. Quietly, groups learned which dry parts of a shelter remained miraculously dry, where runoff inevitably traveled, how the unpredictable wind shifted the blinding smoke, and which specific materials stubbornly resisted water. They discovered that heavy, damp logs could sometimes be cleverly split to expose beautifully drier wood inside. Dry bark, resinous twigs, dry fungi, and very carefully protected fibers could preserve a precious flame or carry a glowing ember. None of this, of course, required one singular, heroic genius named Gronk inventing weatherproofing on a random Tuesday. It required entire, soggy generations of highly observant people noticing what actually worked and clearly remembering exactly who had nearly frozen to death when it did not. The relentless storm also fundamentally changed the group's internal economy. Food had to be strictly rationed, dry fuel had to be jealously guarded, and wet hides had to be painstakingly scraped, stretched, thoroughly dried, and repeatedly moved so they would not rot into a smelly mush. Broken spear points could be meticulously replaced. Heavy stone cores could be carefully reduced into sharp blades and flakes. Crooked wooden shafts could be patiently straightened near the comforting fire. A long week of rain trapped absolutely everyone together, but it also miraculously created concentrated, uninterrupted hours for vital maintenance, quiet observation, and intergenerational teaching. The chaotic hunt had stopped. The cozy workshop had opened. Archaeology, unfortunately, cannot hand us a prehistoric wall calendar labeled Day 4, still raining. Rain leaves notoriously complicated traces, and most activities inside a shelter could have easily happened during a sudden storm, a freezing cold night, or perhaps an unusually aggressive Tuesday. But ancient floors stubbornly preserve telling patterns. Around cozy hearths, modern archaeologists find rich concentrations of burned bone, stone flakes, discarded broken tools, colorful pigments, and ancient food remains. These dense clusters clearly show that fire was not merely a passive heater sitting quietly in the corner. It actively organized domestic life. People sat closely near it to eat, work, warmly socialize, and perform the timeless, deeply human ritual of moving slightly closer to the flames while loudly insisting they were not cold at all. Tool making, meanwhile, produced thousands of incredibly sharp, tiny fragments called debitage. Their precise distribution can reveal exactly where a prehistoric stone napper sat, how raw material was casually passed around, and which specific parts of a shelter were used repeatedly over generations. During prolonged bad weather, this detailed work offered an obvious massive advantage. Damaged spear points could be easily replaced. Dull cutting edges could be freshly refreshed. Wooden shafts could be scraped perfectly smooth. The essential equipment needed after the storm could be completely prepared long before anyone stepped outside into the bright sunlight. More delicate, fascinating evidence reveals even greater levels of patience. At the famous Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered sophisticated ochre processing kits dating to roughly 100,000 years ago. People ground colorful pigment, mixed secret ingredients, and stored the paste inside abalone shells. Whether the colorful substance decorated bodies, protected sensitive skin, treated raw materials, carried deep symbolic meaning, or did several of these jobs at once remains delightfully uncertain. What is absolutely clear is that the entire process required serious planning. Then there was string. At Abri, du Maras in France, microscopic, suspiciously twisted plant fibers clinging to a stone tool clearly indicate that our hardy Neanderthal cousins were already diligently producing high-quality cordage tens of thousands of years ago. Now, fashioning a truly reliable cord is no lazy afternoon task. It demands carefully selecting choice fibers, meticulously separating them, twisting the individual strands with agonizing precision, and then counterintuitively combining them in the opposite direction so the entire clever structure stubborn-mindedly holds together. This is absolutely not some brainless, primitive fiddling. It is, quite frankly, brilliant engineering with vegetables. This handy cordage could gloriously support fishing nets, sneaky traps, firmly hafted tools, sturdy containers, snug clothing, robust shelters, and practically anything else that was immensely improved by tying one stubborn object securely to another. It was spectacularly useful back then, yet remains almost entirely invisible to modern archaeologists simply because organic plant fiber has a rude habit of decaying into nothingness. Thus, the clearest archaeological evidence does not depict our ancient ancestors staring blankly and helplessly out at the dreary rain. Instead, it reveals cozy shelters bustling with life, functioning simultaneously as smoky kitchens, cluttered repair shops, chaotic classrooms, primitive laboratories, and vibrant social hubs. The raging storm outside severely restricted any outdoor gallivanting. Inside, however, nimble human hands kept frantically moving. Yet, here lies the deeply frustrating part for modern researchers. Archaeologists can readily identify a cozy hearth, a dusty tool-making corner, and sometimes even pinpoint exactly where different eccentric family members sat, but they stubbornly cannot identify a specific rainy Thursday. This frustratingly leaves a rather massive gap between dry scientific facts and what sounds wonderfully, irresistibly plausible. Take the art of storytelling, for instance. Fascinating modern ethnographic research among the Jew/Hoansi communities reveals that while pragmatic daytime conversations usually focus on boring, practical matters, cozy firelit conversations magically shift toward dramatic stories, distant acquaintances, complex social gossip, and the spooky supernatural. Of course, this doesn't definitively prove that Paleolithic humans spent dreary, stormy weeks inventing epic cosmic legends. Modern hunter-gatherers are certainly not frozen living fossils, and those ancient minds unfortunately neglected to leave behind written transcripts. Nevertheless, the potent combination of crackling fire, enveloping darkness, and intensely enforced togetherness creates the absolute perfect breeding ground for a good yarn. After all, nobody can seriously inspect razor-sharp spear points for 6 mind-numbing hours straight without eventually sighing and asking, "Did I ever tell you about the massive bison that nearly stomped your poor uncle to death?" Language, too, may have received a massive boost from these agonizingly long indoor stretches. Highly complex survival skills such as tricky cordage production, tedious hide preparation, precise tool hafting, and delicate stone knapping are vastly easier to master when an experienced expert can patiently demonstrate each step over and over again. Sure, some basic knowledge can be easily copied just by silently watching. But other, trickier wisdom demands constant verbal correction, elaborate explanation, and the frustrating prehistoric equivalent of "no, you absolute amateur, twist it the other way." Still, the romantic idea that lousy weather directly caused superior language is utterly impossible to scientifically test. Spoken language, as it turns out, fossilizes extremely poorly, mostly because it stubbornly refuses to fossilize at all. Meanwhile, ancient cave art inspires an even more deliciously tempting narrative. Perhaps, one might dream, bored hunters trapped indoors simply began drawing wild animals on the walls out of sheer, mind-numbing boredom, and, poof, humanity suddenly possessed high art. It is a charming image, certainly. It is also entirely unsupported by any actual evidence. Many of these beautifully decorated caves were absolutely not cozy, comfortable living rooms. Instead, these striking images frequently appear in deep, terrifyingly dark, suffocating chambers that required smoky lamps, precious fuel, meticulous planning, and highly deliberate, brave movement. That strongly suggests a deeply purposeful, highly symbolic activity, rather than some lazy teenager doodling near the sunlit entrance because their prehistoric weather app looked hopelessly grim. Rain may have generously provided the spare time, but time alone can never fully explain the miracle of art. Then, of course, there is the delicate question of social harmony. Being trapped inside could certainly strengthen cooperative bonds through the cozy sharing of scarce food, mutual grooming, patient teaching, primitive music making, and theatrical storytelling. But, let's be honest, it could also trigger absolute murderous conflict. These tiny, cramped shelters were plagued by choking smoke, deafening noise, horribly restless children, strictly limited supplies, and a distinct lack of private master bedrooms. Ancient humans were undeniably socially intelligent creatures, but they were, at the end of the day, still deeply flawed humans. Someone in that cave was absolutely, unapologetically taking up far too much precious floor space. Therefore, our safest scientific conclusion remains quite modest. Prolonged periods of terrible weather probably forced a dense concentration of frustrated people, urgent work, and loud conversation inside these smoky shelters. That intense concentration naturally created far more golden opportunities for patient teaching, collective memory, strategic planning, sacred ritual, and bitter domestic argument. Archaeology can comfortably support the physical evidence of these activities, but it can never truly reconstruct the exact, tense emotional atmosphere of the room. Perhaps a miserable, rainy week inspired a magnificent creation myth. Perhaps it simply inspired a slightly sturdier knot. Or perhaps, quite hilariously, it inspired the very first optimistic soul to step outside, squint at the gray sky, and announce entirely incorrectly, "I think it is finally clearing up." A single rainy week certainly did not magically invent human civilization. History is rarely ever that neat and convenient. But those repeated, agonizing encounters with absolutely dreadful weather undoubtedly rewarded many of the same behaviors that later made settled life delightfully possible. The very first of these noble behaviors was, of course, strategic investment. A flimsy, temporary windbreak is admittedly quite useful for a single soggy night. However, a sturdy, well-constructed hut suddenly becomes immensely worthwhile when a wandering group expects to return, remain significantly longer, or protect their increasingly valuable supplies. At a cozy hollow bend beside the ancient Sea of Galilee, remarkably clever hunter-gatherers built sturdy brush huts roughly 23,000 years ago. They diligently maintained warm hearths, laboriously processed wild cereals, and carefully organized their daily activities within highly recognizable, organized living spaces. This was admittedly not yet a modern suburban village complete with bureaucratic zoning laws and that one inevitably grumpy neighbor who objects to absolutely everything, but it was certainly a massive step up from shivering miserably beneath the nearest leaky tree. Naturally, better shelters demanded highly coordinated, cooperative labor. Someone had to gather strong branches. Someone else dragged the heavy hides. Someone dutifully repaired the leaky roof, while another wise soul carefully selected a prime location that would not conveniently transform into an indoor pond after the first serious storm. Thus, construction brilliantly turned basic weather observation into genuine, albeit primitive, architecture. Storage changed this existential equation even more dramatically. When food could be dried, smoked, buried deep, hung high, or neatly kept in primitive containers, people gained a wonderful shield against those bleak days when active hunting and gathering became thoroughly difficult. But this glorious stored food quickly created pesky new responsibilities. It had to be vigilantly guarded from creeping moisture, hungry insects, wild animals, and, of course, fellow humans who suddenly developed an incredibly flexible, highly convenient interpretation of shared communal resources. Storage also naturally encouraged much longer stays. Longer stays conveniently justified sturdier, heavier shelters. Sturdier shelters joyfully created more physical space for personal possessions. More possessions made nomadic moving notoriously harder. Congratulations! You now officially have furniture. Over many generations, these cozy feedback loops helped steadily transform temporary camps into places rich with histories. A beloved hearth was repeatedly rebuilt in the exact same cozy spot. A busy working floor gradually accumulated centuries of dusty debris. A damaged shelter was painstakingly repaired rather than lazily abandoned. Children grew up fondly remembering not only a vast, wild landscape, but a very particular warm home within it. As communities became increasingly settled during the gradual transition toward agriculture, weather management rapidly expanded into a form of collective engineering. Roofs constantly needed routine maintenance. Muddy drainage channels had to strategically redirect heavy runoff. Precious grain strictly required bone-dry storage. Houses suddenly stood so close together that one careless family's badly managed rainwater could easily become everybody's unwanted indoor swimming pool. Cooperation was no longer merely helpful during a chaotic hunt. It became deeply embedded in daily construction, food security, basic sanitation, and general community survival. Beautiful rituals naturally followed many of these shared spaces. Repeated, cozy gatherings around crackling hearths, houses, solemn graves, and communal buildings gave physical places a profound emotional meaning. The shelter was no longer just a dry spot where shivering bodies stayed reasonably dry. It quickly became the sacred place where ancient ancestors were fondly remembered. Complex social obligations were carefully negotiated. Warm meals were shared, and communal belonging was actively performed. Rain itself certainly did not build the first great civilization, but every howling storm served to remind early humans that overall survival vastly improved when their preparation lasted longer than the temporary weather. Today, a miserable week of rain usually means disappointingly canceled plans, annoyingly damp shoes, and the sudden, shocking discovery that absolutely everyone in the house has a wildly different opinion about the ideal indoor temperature. We casually make hot coffee. We lazily order food. We mindlessly watch colorful stories on glowing screens while the rain harmlessly taps against advanced materials engineered by brilliant people we will never actually meet. The sturdy roof miraculously holds. The electric lights reliably stay on. The quiet refrigerator faithfully guards several days of cool calories without requiring a single person to scrape a smelly hide, split a heavy log, or patiently explain to a terrified child why the nearby river is currently trying to enter their living room. That extraordinary modern comfort can make ancient rainy weeks seem almost utterly unrecognizable. But our fundamental behavior is absolutely not. We still eagerly gather in protected, warm spaces. We still painstakingly repair things, optimistically prepare for better weather, teach curious children, tell imaginative stories, play silly games, share delicious food, and inevitably become mildly irritated by the very people we love most. We still gratefully use forced confinement to reorganize our chaotic lives. A passing storm beautifully slows down the frantic outside world, and our collective attention turns warmly inward toward the cozy home, the immediate group, and whatever can be creatively made with the hands and time available. For ancient humans, those dark, rainy hours were not empty at all. They were survival made wonderfully quieter. The diligent person carefully maintaining the fading embers was actively protecting tomorrow's vital warmth. The focused person quietly twisting rough fiber was busily building future hunting nets, strong bindings, or reliable shelter. The animated person passionately retelling a dangerous hunt was delightfully entertaining the huddled group, but also, quite brilliantly passing along crucial, life-saving information about wild animals, treacherous landscapes, heroic courage, and, of course, highly embarrassing mistakes. Even a spectacularly loud argument over the best food portions or prime sleeping spaces served a grand purpose, teaching those ancient folks the delicate, often agonizing art of negotiating life inside a tight-knit community. This, quite possibly, is the true, deeper significance of dreadful weather. It repeatedly and relentlessly forced humans to practice the difficult art of being human when physical movement was severely limited and cooperation became utterly, hilariously unavoidable. We fondly imagine human evolution happening exclusively during highly dramatic, cinematic moments. The thrilling hunt, the epic migration, or the terrifying confrontation with a hungry predator. Yet, in truth, much of human life was quietly shaped during these mundane pauses. Patiently waiting beside a flickering fire, meticulously repairing a half-broken tool, listening to an older, perhaps slightly repetitive voice, and slowly absorbing what the group remembered. Persistent rain compressed their entire social world beneath a single, cramped roof of cold stone, smelly animal hide, damp wood, or dripping branches. And right there, with stinging smoke in their teary eyes and soggy leather absolutely everywhere, our brave ancestors did not simply sit around waiting for real life to resume. They actively, stubbornly maintained it. So, the very next time it rains incessantly all week and you find yourself trapped indoors, happily devouring stored snacks, watching endless stories on a screen, and fiercely arguing over who gets the warmest seat in the house, please remember this comforting truth. This is not shameful laziness. It is, in fact, a venerable ancient survival strategy. Admittedly, ours just comes with vastly superior snacks.